always a no. Sometimes delays in effect becomes denial because of us, not because of God. So in Luke chapter 18, Jesus tells the parable of the persistent widow. Verse 1 says, "Then he spoke a parable to them that men always ought to pray and not lose heart," and that includes the ladies as well. And he understood that probably because he had said we ought to always pray means sometimes we don't always pray as we should. And he said, "Do not lose heart. There was in a certain city a judge who did not fear God, nor regard man. Now there was a widow in that city, and she came to him saying, 'Get justice for me from my adversary.' And he would not for a while. But afterward he said within himself, 'Though I do not fear God nor regard man, yet because this widow troubles me, I will avenge her, lest by her continual coming she will weary me or wear me out.' Then the Lord said, 'Hear what the unjust judge said. And shall God not avenge his own elect who cry out day and night to him, though he bears long with them? I tell you that he will avenge them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he really find faith on the earth?'" Hopefully, he will always be able to say there will be people with faith on the earth. We're living in different times than I grew up in. My life as a child on a farm was to work on the farm, go to a one-room country school, and then go to church on Sunday. Didn't sound very exciting, but that was the typical routine every week. And school was involved. We were in school involved, and almost everybody that went to school, the parents and families went to the same country church that was less than a half a mile from the school building. You and I need to remember that God always hears the true prayer. Sometimes we don't feel like it. Sometimes when we are praying, it feels like it drips down from the ceiling, and it doesn't ever penetrate through to the Lord. But God always hears the true prayer. Not all prayers are true. We say some prayers, sometimes we get so used to saying them that we don't think about them anymore. We had a prayer that we said at all of our meals around the house when I was growing up. It happened to be in Norwegian. So I know one prayer that's in Norwegian. I know mostly what it means, but I never did know totally what it meant. But my father was Norwegian, my mother was Norwegian, so Norwegian was the thing. We were in a Norwegian community, obviously, in North Dakota. Sometimes when we say what we say during prayer, or even what we think during prayer, is not really our true prayer. The subconscious level, our minds may be thinking something else. The motivations behind our prayer may be suspect. James said of that he says, "You ask and do not receive because you ask amiss that you may spend it on your own pleasures." In other words, why are we praying the prayers that we're praying? Do we ever get beyond praying for ourselves or our families or our small communities and that, or do we branch out and all of that? You and I can say a prayer out loud and have something else going on in our mind. Have you ever read a whole page and you read every word of it and you couldn't remember anything you read because you weren't paying attention to your own reading? And sometimes God knows sometimes we get in that kind of a setting with him as well. Jesus said, "Ask and it shall be given to you, seek and you shall find, knock and it shall be opened unto you." Matthew 7:7, that's in the great Sermon on the Mount that Jesus preached. Ask, knock, seek, and we'll find it and we'll get it. That sounds definite, but sometimes it doesn't seem to work out that way when we are praying about some things. One of the things is it's hard to be patient in prayer. Lord, give it to me right now and answer my prayer right now. And sometimes the Lord doesn't understand we're not ready for that. He understands we're not ready to really get and sometimes he knows that we really don't mean it. But yet in Matthew 7:7, Jesus said, ask and it'll be given to you. Seek and you shall find. Knock and it shall be opened unto you. For those who ask, receive. Those who seek, find. And those who knock, the doors are open. That's a positively certain to me. And I think we all think about that. That's a positive thing. How could it seem like then that God doesn't hear my prayers or God doesn't answer my prayers? How often have we asked in prayer and actually believed it wouldn't be done? But it was the right prayer to pray. It's the right thing to do. But secretly down deep in our souls and hearts and minds, we knew it wasn't going to happen because it probably wasn't the right prayer in the beginning to begin with. How we want to believe and hope that it will be done, but we also allow doubts to enter in even before we begin to pray and continue to pray. Jesus said, you may ask me for anything in my name, and I'll do it. But he also said, if you love me, you will do what I command. Oh, there's that condition. There are conditions to having our prayers answered by the Lord. God's oftentimes hearing our actual prayers of doubts. God knows when we're asking without any intentions of being obedient to him. God doesn't want us to doubt. You know, if we've all, how many grew up in the church all of your life? You don't know anything else. You don't know what you would do on a Sunday if you didn't go to church. It'd be a lost day, basically, you know. You realize how lucky you are, how fortunate you are to realize that you have parents that took you to church and went to church with you. I wasn't always that excited about going to church, but I never had to wonder what we would do Sunday morning. I knew where we'd be. We would be in church because the church was built on my grandfather's land, and it was less than a mile from the house, and we saw it every day. So I knew that, and yet there are a lot of people that, I don't know what to do Sunday. I grew up in an age, those of you that are 80 years or older, I happen to be in that bracket. I know there's at least one lady here that's over 90. I mean, there was nothing else you could do on Sunday. They rolled up the sidewalks in the town on Saturday night, and they didn't unroll them again till Monday morning. So nothing happened. If you were going to go someplace on Sunday and drive someplace, you had to make sure you had enough gasoline to get back because there was not a service station open on Sunday. Everything, you know, and some of you youngsters say, how in the world could you live like that? Well, we didn't know any better because that's the way it happened to be. So God always hears our true prayers. Second, there are reasons why God delays his answer to us. Now, if it's a personal prayer, if it's a prayer that you are praying concerning yourself, his delay might be due to his tarrying love for us. He might have to convince us that he loves us without answering our prayers all the time. You know? We know that God said he'd always love us, but do we always sense that love? Sometimes we haven't considered our desires very well when we prayed. In delay, you may come to realize that that is not what you really wanted after all. Sometimes God may be testing our persistence. This widow that is told about the parable that Jesus tells, she persisted. Now, the judge answered for the wrong reason, but he did the right thing. Now, if you and I persist with God, he won't answer for the wrong reason. He will answer because he is God, and it'll be a right answer when it comes to us. It always will be that. There will be, I've heard people say, you shouldn't have to pray about anything more than once. And you really don't have the faith if you pray it a second time, or goodness gracious, the third time. I do know it's right to pray 3 times because Jesus said the same prayer in Gethsemane the night he was arrested. Lord, if it's possible, let this burden pass from me. He'd asked 3 of his disciples to pray, and he'd gone off a ways, and he came back and said to watch and pray. Well, they were sleeping and not watching and praying. So he went again, and he prayed that same prayer again. They came back, and his 3 disciples were sleeping again. He said, well, you're tired. You might as well go ahead and just keep on sleeping. The 3rd time he came to his Father, he said, nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. There will be times in our life that God will ask us to do some things that we don't want to have to do. We may experience some things that we don't want to have to experience. Jesus didn't want to have to experience the pain of hanging on the cross after being beaten and his back bleeding because he had been switched and all of that. It had a crown of thorns on his head that brought blood to the surface. He didn't want to, as the human element in him says, I'm not going to like this. It's going to be painful. But eventually, he said, Father, not my will, but your will be done. Now, if we're praying for someone else, especially for those that might be saved, we have to remember that God has to wait on them to be ready. The Bible says that no one comes to the Father unless the Spirit of God draws him. If you have grandkids, you probably have said a lot of prayers for your grandkids, you know. I did the wedding for one grandkid Thursday night, grandson, and I never thought I would live long enough to preside at a wedding for a grandson, you know. Because at 84, not everybody makes 84. And there's 4 more if they're going to get married, but I pray that this is the only one that I'll have to do the thing about. And next time I want to be able to watch it from where you were sitting instead of be up there in the front. But the element of waiting. Has God ever waited for you? He's been trying to get your attention for a long time. You're hearing, but you're not listening. You know, I saw a bumper sticker a number of years on a vehicle that says, I hear you, but I'm not listening. How many times do we catch ourselves hearing God, but not listening? You know. And finally, we begin to listen. And God is patiently waiting on us to get to that place where not only will we hear, but we will also wait for and listen to what he says. See, wait for everybody. It'd be great if everybody gets saved right away when they first realize they should be saved and all of that. It'd be wonderful if that was the case. It would be wonderful if people that had gotten saved would stay in the presence of the Lord all their life, you know. But sometimes they begin strong, and they end up weak and lose out in their faith. But God will always be faithful to do his part if we will do ours. Now, if it's a prayer for the church, and I'm sure that you pray for one another in this congregation, if it's a special prayer, and I know pastors have these prayers all the time. Pastors have certain prayers for the church that they pray and pray and pray about, and it never seems to happen. Sometimes pastors will say, Lord, if you would just send your Holy Spirit afresh and anew. And you have another service and it's dead. Another service and it's dead. It is another service and it's dead. You begin to wonder if God is going to ever do anything at all. When one of the churches we had the privilege of pastoring for almost 7 years, we'd had a men's prayer meeting started by laymen, and I agreed that I would come every Thursday night and we'd have a prayer meeting. Started out strong, 6, 7 guys. Got a little weaker, got a little weaker, got a little weaker, got to one other coming besides myself for several months. And then when I was preaching through a series and I had no idea that God was going to do something and answer the prayer that I had been praying for a long time, I was preaching a series of sermons on the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, the 23rd Psalm. I have, I think, 14 messages of the 23rd Psalm that I've that I built out of a book that had written, it was a shepherd's look at the 23rd Psalm, so explained every verse of it, or every phrase of it, and the Sunday morning that I preached, He restores my soul. I couldn't tell anything was going on. Didn't tell anything was different. That was about the fourth sermon, I think, out of the group. And somehow I asked the congregation to stand, and I prayed this short prayer: Lord, help the people to do what they need to do today. And in that short prayer, the altars were plumb full. But I didn't sense anything was going on. But something was going on. And that changed that congregation for all. That carried on for a year and a half. We had these wonderfully long services. From that day forth, that Sunday forth, every Sunday morning, we didn't get out till 1 o'clock. And I was through before 12. So I came to the church board and I said, let's move the service up 25 minutes. Let's do it 10:35 instead of 11 a.m. And I told the church board, I promise I will be through preaching at 11:15 every Sunday morning. And I kept that promise, and guess what happened? We still didn't get out till 1 o'clock. When I had the next church board meeting, the board says, Pastor, we're still not getting out till 1 o'clock. You said we'd get out earlier. Well, my intentions were that we would get out earlier, because I knew, it's hard to beat the Baptist to church, to the cafe, if you're going to stay till 1 o'clock. They'll already be there, And I said, but it's not me that's causing them to leave long, is it? No. But how many prayers had been prayed that would happen? I don't know. I know I'd prayed a batch of them. I know all of that, that I know that the congregations pray that the church may grow in numbers. Guess what happened with that revival? The church grew in numbers. 35 new people on a Sunday morning that I'd never seen before. We had a choir, and the church choir loft. The choir couldn't go down because there wasn't any place to sit in the church. And this went on for quite a while. Eventually, we ended up building a building, and I wasn't for that, but we did it anyway. But in this process of new people, I got a call one day asking if I'd be willing to meet with some of the church people on that night's evening. I said, yeah, I'll be there. I'll open up the church. And so I said, what do you want to talk about? They blew me away. Pastor, there's so many new people now. It's not the same anymore. We really don't like it. It's different. Our seating places have been taken, in that. And I said, I will take the blame for that. I said, I prayed, Lord, if you will bring them in, I'll do my best to minister to them. And I said, evidently God thought I met that prayer. I'd read and heard about that there are difficult times when revival comes because not everybody gets revived. I had a gentleman in the church that was gone for a while, and I went to visit him in his home during this time that was going on. He said, Pastor, I don't know if I can come back to church. I said, why? There's so many new people. I said, it'll be all right. You'll be all right. You can come back. And he came back. And he was one of many men that prayer meeting that had gone down to 2 guys grew to about 16 guys on Thursday nights. We never read a scripture. I would ask them, I said, what's our prayer request? We did the strangest thing. We all prayed one at a time out loud. And with 16 guys, it always took 2 hours praying. And in the midst of that, they were so excited about it, they started naming people that they wanted to see get saved. So we would pray that prayer. We'd pray for that individual. Everybody would, as they took their turns praying out loud, and we agreeing with one another. One of them said to me, "Pastor, do you realize what's been going on?" I said, "What? So much been going on, I could not keep up with it." He said, "Everybody we praise for that Thursday night gets saved that Sunday morning." And I looked back and I said, "You know, you're right." Why did it start happening then? Because the people of God were ready to have it start happening then, even though some weren't always so happy about it happening then. But people started coming in, people that I didn't know, at all. So you have to be, I've learned this, you have to be careful what you pray about. Because if you pray about something like that, you better mean it. You better mean that you're willing to make the adjustment and to say, my place has been taken by somebody else, but I'll move on, or up or back or forward or out. We had to, for a period of time, we had to open the fellowship hall. We had a long way, and we'd set up about 65 chairs in there because our sanctuary only would hold 165, and we were running about 220 to 230 at that time. But to those who persist in prayer, they will receive answers. There are answers for every one of us. There's 3 ways God can answer. The one we really want is yes. Another one that we sure don't want is wait. Lord, give me patience and give it to me right now, And sometimes he will say no. And we won't understand it. We won't understand it at all. When I got out of the Marine Corps, I didn't know what I was going to do, but I thought I wanted to be a good layman in a local church. I had the desire to make the most money so I could give the biggest amount of money in the tithes and offerings. During that time, I was service manager in a Ford Mercury dealership in a small town next to where I grew up, and I had applied for jobs, and nothing would happen. Nothing would happen. And I got in my car to leave the garage. I probably drove 50 feet, and God spoke to me, and I wasn't praying. God spoke to me and said, you can make all the applications you want. You will never get any of them because I want you to preach the word. What? I liked being a layman. I want you to preach the word. Okay, let's see. I wonder how I'm going to tell my wife about that. Boy, because that was not on the wavelength at all. That was not in my bucket of desires at all. I had a grandfather that was a minister. I had an uncle that was a minister. Linda had asked me if I'd ever consider preaching, and I said, no, you can't teach old dog new tricks. Because I could not imagine standing up in front, speaking and making some sense with a group of people. I couldn't imagine that. I'd sung up front with choirs and quartets and duets and not many solos. That's different. And finally, I got the nerve up and I said to Linda, I've got the call to preach. Oh, I know. When did you find out? Oh, before you did, So then we made the decision. Now what am I going to do? I'm 30 years old. I've not been to college. I was a high school kid. I went to automatic mechanic school, but I hated school. I just did not like school at all, unless it was for a trade of some kind. I liked the auto mechanic school part because I was going to work on cars, and I had an auto shop for a period of time before I went into service and that. So I wrote a letter to my pastor that we'd last been members of in Memphis, Tennessee, and he said, well, I knew you were going to be called to preach, but I wasn't going to say a word to you because I didn't want to come from me. I wanted it to come to you from God. He says, you might consider the Bible college out in Colorado Springs. I didn't even know the place existed, because we were new Nazarenes. We hadn't been Nazarenes for too long. We joined Nazarenes in Yuma, Arizona when we were there, when I was stationed there. So I went there. We had 2 kids. how am we going to do this? Went to Colorado Springs. The couples had us come and stay out there at the Bible College. Just sophomores and just seniors opened their homes to new people coming in till they could find a place. We stayed with a couple that did they have any kids? One, okay. It's been so many years I can't remember, you know. But you know what? When I started that school, I loved school. You know why? I was called to preach, and I had a purpose of going to school. And I thought, well, man, I'm through with they had three-year class at that. You get an Associate of Arts. It was enough to be ordained in the Church of the Nazarene. And then I'm pastoring for a number of years, and I feel like, I'd like to go to college and get my bachelor's degree, because I could sense everyone was a little more educated. At one time, high school was a lot high education. Then all of a sudden, there's not a high education anymore. People are becoming college students and graduating from college. And, you have to feel like as a leader of the church, you've got a little bit of education behind you. So that's how we came into Oklahoma. Was Bill Birch was district superintendent at the time. He found a church in Hydro that would accept me and let me go to college in Bethany and get my bachelor's degree. We were going to leave Oklahoma right after that. Well, we haven't gotten around to it yet. That was in 1979. I guess we'll stay. And then a few years later on, when I was pastoring at Cedar Springs, God said, you ought to go get a master's degree. What? Yeah. And I wrestled with that, and I'd sent a card to it was BNC at the time, now it says I knew. I sent a card there that was interested. There was a Master of Ministry program. And lo and behold, I got a telephone call from the one that was in charge of the Master of Ministries degree program. He said, we have a class starting on Monday. Would you like to start with us? I said, you're supposed to start in a certain sequence, aren't you? What sequence are you on? Well, it's third or fourth down the road, but we'll let you start there, and you don't have to have your pre-work done. We'll let you get that done, and after you go back home, and lo and behold, I got a master's degree, and thank God he called me to get a doctorate. But the amazing thing is, all of that happened in our lives would have never happened without God's direct communication with us. My dad and mom didn't fully comprehend all of that stuff. When I went in the Marine Corps, I was crazy during Vietnam, and I re-enlisted in Vietnam. So that tells you that you're not real brilliant when you enlist in a war zone, But I did anyway, And my plan was to go for 6 years on the re-enlistment. At the last minute, I went for 3 years. Had no idea why. And God said he'd be too old, called to preach if he put 6 years down. So I put 3 years down. And I tell you what, because of God hearing prayers and God answering prayers, life has been phenomenal. I took a $2,400 pay cut when I got out of the Marine Corps. $2,400, and that was in what year? 1971, I got out. See, she doesn't have her note cards up where I can read them yet, She didn't know I was going to ask that question. But God supplied because he trusted us. And the question I have is, can God trust you? He'll answer some prayers you're not praying. He will put thoughts in your minds that you have never thought about before. I went to Bible college, and Uncle Sam paid for a lot of it. I got 46 months worth of education. And of course, when school stopped at the end of spring, so did the payments from the government stopped until it started in fall. I was busy working full time and going to school, so I never looked at the checkbook and out anything at all. I said to Linda, I said, how are we going to do in the summer when we lose that X number of dollars from the government? Well, she said the closest I can figure out is we're going to run $100 short each month for 3 months or 4 months. And this was my statement to her. I said, well, the first check we write off of our check that we get from the income, I was working at high school custodian at the time. The first check we write out of every one of those checks when we're going to be short is the tithe. Not going to be on what left over, it's going to be on what we already have. You know what happened? We only went $20 a month behind, and we had enough to cover that. You want to tell me that God isn't good? You haven't want to tell me that it doesn't work to pray? It works. It works to pray. But there's still some prayers that I have not had answered. But I know they will be eventually, one way or another. You know, when you've got 5 grandsons, you know you've got people to pray for, you know, because you're hoping they'll find their way in the right way of life and all of that stuff. But just because he delays, man, I almost did 45 minutes. Just because he delays doesn't mean it's a no. It doesn't mean it's a no. If he means it to be a no, he will tell you. But you will not be disappointed because he will somehow have prepared you in that process of waiting that you will accept the no. But most of the time, you'll get the yes, you know, in most unusual ways, most unusual ways. So never give up praying. I always felt like I was so fortunate. I had senior adults in every church that I pastored, and I knew they knew how to pray because they'd been practicing it for years. And sometimes when they were retired, they had more time in their hands, so they could pray. Young couples are busy raising families, are trying to make a living, working jobs, trying to get their kids educated and all of that, and trying to get them grown up in a certain way. They don't have a lot of time to pray. My mother said this after her dad died, and he was the minister. She said, I recognized things weren't going the same as they should be in our family after he died. And the Lord said, you know, your dad was a prayer warrior. He prayed for all of us every day. And all of a sudden, those prayers aren't there anymore. So my mother said, I realized I had to take up the mantle and become the prayer warrior for the family. So somebody will always be called to do something that they are not normally doing otherwise. But keep on praying, keep on trusting, keep on believing, and recognize that God hears and will answer your prayers and bring delight and joy into your soul and spirit. Let's stand for a closing word of prayer. Is it all right to close it that way? Father, you're a mighty fine God, a wonderful God. That special time and relationship with you.